Shadows on the sidewalk. The streets were unusually quiet, the cool autumn air settling over the city in a gentle, melancholic embrace. Officer John Matthews stepped out of his patrol car, his boots clicking softly against the pavement as he scanned the area. The faint glow of the street lamps stretched shadows across the deserted streets, amplifying the quietness around him. It was late, almost midnight. The quiet was both a comfort and an alert, a reminder that peace was often a fragile thing. His shift was nearing an end, but there was something about the silence that kept him lingering. Maybe it was intuition, or maybe it was just the weight of another night filled with unseen stories and unheard voices. Then he saw him, a small, solitary figure sitting on the edge of the concrete sidewalk, knees drawn close to his chest. His head was bowed, hiding his face beneath the shadow cast by his hoodie. John approached slowly, keeping his steps light, careful not to startle the boy. He couldn't be more than 12 or 13, his frame thin and his clothes worn. "Hey there, buddy," John said gently, kneeling a few feet away. "It's pretty late to be out here alone." The boy didn't respond. His gaze stayed fixed on the ground, his hands clenched tightly around something John couldn't quite make out. He seemed lost, not just physically, but in a way that went much deeper. John's heart twisted at the sight. He'd encountered kids in trouble before, but something about this boy felt different, a sadness too profound for someone his age. John lowered himself onto one knee, bringing himself closer to the boy's level. "My name's Officer John Matthews, but you can call me John if that feels better," he said, keeping his tone soft and steady. "I just want to make sure you're okay. Can you tell me what's going on?" A minute passed in silence, and John didn't press. He knew the weight of trust and how long it could take to build. He stayed quiet, giving the boy time, his attention unwavering. Slowly, the boy's fingers tightened around the object he held, and John realized it was a photograph. "I don't have anywhere to go," the boy whispered finally, his voice so soft it almost got lost in the stillness of the night. John felt a pang in his chest, understanding more in that one statement than words could convey. He knew what it was to feel alone, but a child should never have to bear that kind of weight. "Do you have a name?" John asked gently, letting his words fill the air between them with warmth. The boy's head lifted just a little, and for the first time, John caught a glimpse of his face. His eyes were filled with a mixture of fear and something even more unsettling. Resignation. "Caleb," he murmured, almost as if speaking the name caused him pain. "It's nice to meet you, Caleb," John said with a small smile. "How about we find somewhere warmer to talk? Just a safe spot where we can figure things out together. Does that sound all right?" Caleb's shoulders tensed, and John could sense the conflict within him. The boy looked like he was holding on by a thread, his whole body coiled as if ready to flee at any moment. But then, after what felt like an eternity, he gave a tiny nod, the faintest glimmer of hope flickering in his eyes. John extended his hand, palm open, waiting patiently. Caleb looked at it, then back at John's face, his own expression filled with uncertainty. Finally, with a slight hesitation, Caleb reached out, his hand trembling as it met John's. Together, they stood, and John felt the weight of the boy's sadness in that one small gesture. As they walked to the patrol car, John kept his hand on Caleb's shoulder, a silent reassurance that he was safe. He opened the back door, helping Caleb settle in. As he did, he noticed that Caleb's grip on the photograph had not loosened. If anything, he clutched it even tighter, as if it were the only thing anchoring him to this world. "You're safe now," John assured him, his voice low and steady as he closed the door and moved to the driver's side. Caleb sat motionless in the back seat, his eyes fixed on something far beyond the view from the window. John decided not to drive too far. A few blocks down, he pulled over, wanting to better understand Caleb's situation before making any decisions. He glanced in the rearview mirror, watching as Caleb stared at the photograph in his hands. It was worn and frayed at the edges, as if it had been handled hundreds of times. "That must be a special photo you're holding," John said softly, hoping to open a bridge of connection. Caleb flinched slightly, his fingers tightening even more around the picture. He seemed to curl into himself, shoulders hunched as if trying to shield the photo from view. John noticed Caleb's lower lip tremble, and his heart ached at the sight. Whatever this photo held, it was more than just an image to Caleb. It was a part of him, a piece of a world he was desperately clinging to. "You don't have to show me," John reassured him quickly, sensing the boy's protectiveness. "I just want you to know that whatever it is, you're safe here. And I'm here to help in any way I can." Caleb's gaze lifted for a moment, meeting John's in the rearview mirror. There was a deep sadness in those young eyes, a sorrow that went beyond mere loneliness. John had seen grief before. He'd seen it in adults who'd lost everything, in families torn apart by tragedy. But seeing it in a child as young as Caleb felt like a wound he couldn't quite understand. After a few moments of silence, John made a decision. This boy needed more than just a place to sleep. He needed comfort, warmth, and reassurance that the world could still be kind. He couldn't, in good conscience, leave him alone or drop him off at a shelter. "Caleb," he said softly, turning to look at him directly, "I have a warm home not far from here. My wife Emma is an incredible cook, and I think she'd be more than happy to make you something warm to eat. Would you like to come stay with us tonight?" Caleb looked up, his expression shifting between hope and fear, as if daring to believe in kindness was almost too much for him. He searched John's face for any sign of deception, but John kept his gaze steady, filled with genuine warmth and concern. "You don't have to be afraid, Caleb," John assured him, his voice unwavering. "Just one night, and we'll figure things out together tomorrow. What do you say?" Finally, Caleb gave a slight nod, his hand still clutching the photograph, as if it were his lifeline. John offered him a small, reassuring smile before putting the car in drive. As they pulled away from the curb, he glanced once more in the mirror. Caleb had turned to look out the window, the alternating lights casting gentle patterns on his face. As they drove through the silent streets, John felt a sense of purpose fill him, a determination to help this boy find his way out of the darkness. Little did he know, this night would change them both in ways they could never imagine, and the journey they were about to embark on would reveal truths neither was prepared for. A house of warmth. The drive to John's house was quiet, filled with the soft hum of the engine and the muted glow of passing streetlights. In the rearview mirror, John caught glimpses of Caleb, who was lost in thought, still clinging to the photograph, as if it were a precious fragment of his world. John's heart ached for the boy, whose silence spoke volumes, and he wondered what sort of loss could have brought him to this lonely place. As they turned onto the winding suburban street leading to John's home, he glanced at his watch. 1:14 a.m. The late hour meant the houses along the street were all dark, the occupants long since asleep. John's own house stood near the end of the cul-de-sac, its warm yellow light glowing softly in the windows. The sight of his home, a place that had become a refuge for him over the years, brought a sense of calm. When he pulled into the driveway, he took a moment before getting out, gathering his thoughts and the right words to make Caleb feel at ease. As he walked around to the back door, he saw Caleb's shoulders tense, like a small animal caught in a trap, unsure whether to fight or flee. "Caleb," John said softly as he opened the door, "this is my home. It's a safe place. No one's going to hurt you here." He extended a hand again, and after a brief hesitation, Caleb took it, sliding out of the car with his gaze still low. John led him to the front door, opening it slowly to avoid startling the boy with any sudden sounds. The warmth of the house greeted them both, a stark contrast to the chill that had settled over the night. Inside, the living room was cozy, adorned with comfortable furniture and soft blankets that John's wife, Emma, had artfully placed around. It was a space that radiated calm and comfort, a place meant for rest and healing. John closed the door quietly and turned on a small lamp, bathing the room in a soft glow. Caleb lingered near the entryway, looking uncertain and hesitant, as if he didn't quite believe he was welcome in such a place. "Why don't you sit down? Make yourself comfortable," John suggested, motioning toward the couch. Caleb hesitated, glancing around as if expecting someone to appear and tell them to leave. But finally, he moved toward the couch, sinking into the cushions with the stiffness of someone who wasn't used to relaxing. John went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, bringing it over to the boy. "Here," he said, handing it to him. Caleb took the glass but didn't drink. He kept his gaze downward, the photograph still clutched tightly in his other hand. "Would you like something to eat?" John asked, keeping his tone light. "Emma always has leftovers. I could make you a sandwich or warm up some soup if you're hungry." Caleb shook his head slowly, his voice barely a whisper. "No, thank you." John nodded, deciding not to press him. He sensed that pushing too hard would only make Caleb retreat further into himself. Instead, he sat down in the armchair across from him, giving him space but remaining close enough to offer comfort. For a few moments, they sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Then John decided to try again, hoping a gentle approach would coax Caleb into opening up, even if only a little. "Do you want to tell me what brought you out there tonight?" John asked, keeping his voice soft and his expression neutral. He didn't want to give off any hint of judgment or pressure. Caleb was silent for a long time. His fingers fidgeted with the edges of the photograph, his gaze distant. Finally, he spoke, his voice trembling. I don't have anywhere else to go." The weight of his words hit John with a force he hadn't expected. He'd known that Caleb's situation was bad. Any child alone on the streets at this hour likely had no one to turn to, but hearing it confirmed out loud made it all too real. "No one at all?" John asked gently. "No family? No friends you could stay with?" Caleb shook his head, his fingers gripping the photo so tightly that his knuckles turned white. John noticed a tear slip down his cheek, though Caleb quickly brushed it away, a habit, it seemed, of trying to hold back his emotions. "That's a special photo, isn't it?" John asked, nodding toward the picture Caleb held. Caleb's shoulders hunched protectively over the photo. He hesitated, looking torn between sharing and keeping it private. But after a long moment, he finally lifted his hand, showing John the photograph. It was a small, worn picture, the edges frayed, and the image slightly faded. In the photograph, a young woman was holding a toddler in her arms, both of them smiling brightly. The woman had kind eyes and a gentle smile, and even through the wear and tear of the photo, her warmth shone through. John could see the resemblance immediately. This woman had to be Caleb's mother. She was my mom," Caleb whispered, his voice breaking. "She died not long ago." John's heart sank as he realized the depth of Caleb's loss. He couldn't imagine the pain this boy had gone through, the loneliness and despair of losing someone so fundamental. And now, here he was, alone in the world, clinging to the only memory he had left. "I'm so sorry, Caleb," John said softly, his voice thick with emotion. That's a lot to go through, especially on your own." Caleb looked down at the photograph, his fingers tracing the edges. "She was the only one who ever cared about me," he said in a broken whisper. "After she died, they put me in foster care, but it wasn't like having a real family. I kept running away, hoping I could find something. I don't even know what anymore." The depth of Caleb's pain was staggering, and John felt a fierce protectiveness rising within him. No child should have to endure this kind of loss and abandonment, forced to fend for themselves without a single person to lean on. "You shouldn't have had to go through that alone, Caleb," John said, his voice laced with compassion. "And you don't have to keep going through it alone. You can stay here tonight. And tomorrow, well, we'll figure something out. But I want you to know, there are people who care about you, people who want to help." Caleb looked at John with a mixture of skepticism and longing, as if he wanted to believe those words but had been hurt too many times to fully trust them. Just then, they heard soft footsteps, and John turned to see his wife, Emma, standing in the doorway, wrapped in a warm robe. Her kind eyes took in the scene, and she immediately understood. She moved forward with a gentle smile, kneeling beside Caleb. "Hi there, Caleb," she said softly, her voice warm and soothing. "I'm Emma. John's told me a little bit about you. I just wanted to say that you're welcome here. This is a safe place." Caleb looked at her, eyes wide, a bit startled by her kindness. Emma reached out, and though he tensed, he didn't pull away as she placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Would you like something warm to drink? Maybe some hot cocoa?" she asked, her tone motherly and reassuring. Caleb hesitated, then gave a small nod, his expression softening slightly. Emma smiled warmly. "I'll be right back." As she moved toward the kitchen, John saw a faint flicker of hope in Caleb's eyes, a spark that hinted at the possibility of trust. For a boy who had experienced so much loss, even the smallest gesture of kindness could mean everything. When Emma returned with the cocoa, she handed it to Caleb, who took it with both hands, savoring the warmth. He took a small sip, and for a brief moment, John saw a glimpse of a regular child enjoying a simple pleasure. "Thank you," Caleb whispered, his voice so soft it was almost inaudible. "You're welcome, sweetheart," Emma replied with a smile. She took a seat next to John, giving Caleb a reassuring nod. "You're safe here, Caleb. We're here to help, and whatever you need, we'll figure it out together." Caleb nodded, his expression guarded but touched. As he sat there, drinking the cocoa and holding his mother's photograph close, John felt a sense of purpose settle over him. This boy had been through more than anyone should ever have to endure, and he was determined to help Caleb find a new path, a new place to belong. The night wore on quietly, the warmth of the home surrounding them all, and for the first time in a long while, Caleb began to feel a glimmer of what it might be like to hope again. A fragile trust. The dawn crept into the quiet house, casting soft rays of light through the living room window. Caleb had fallen asleep on the couch, still clutching his mother's photograph, as if it were his last connection to the world. John had stayed nearby, watching over him through the night, while Emma had left a warm blanket draped over Caleb's small frame. As morning unfolded, John could see the exhaustion in the boy's face, the weariness etched into his young features. Caleb looked as if he hadn't slept well in days, if not longer. John quietly rose from his chair, stretching his back. His movements stirred Emma, who had dozed off on the adjacent sofa. She blinked, taking in the scene before her, and a soft smile formed on her lips as she looked at Caleb's sleeping form. She glanced over at John, who gave her a small nod, both of them sharing a silent agreement. They had to find a way to help this boy, even if they didn't yet know what that would entail. Emma stood, motioning John to the kitchen so they wouldn't disturb Caleb. As they stepped into the warm, sunlit room, she put a hand on John's arm, her expression a mixture of worry and compassion. "He's so young, John," she whispered. "I can't imagine what he's been through. Do you know any more about him?" John shook his head, his voice equally soft. "Not much. His mom passed away recently, and he's been on his own ever since. I can't even fathom how lonely and scared he must feel." Emma's brow furrowed, her thoughts visibly racing. There has to be a way to help him. He can't just go back to a system that's let him down. John nodded, and they fell into a contemplative silence, both of them grappling with the same question. What could they do to provide Caleb with the security he so clearly needed? A few minutes later, Caleb's voice floated softly into the kitchen. Excuse me." Both John and Emma turned, seeing Caleb standing awkwardly in the doorway, looking both hesitant and vulnerable. His hair was tousled from sleep, and he clutched the blanket around himself, his grip on his mother's photograph as firm as ever. There was a rawness to him, As if any harsh word might shatter the fragile trust he tentatively extended. "Good morning, Caleb," Emma said warmly, her voice gentle and inviting. "Did you sleep well?" Caleb gave a small nod, though his eyes looked uncertain. "Yeah, thank you for letting me stay here." Emma moved toward him with a comforting smile. "You're welcome, sweetheart. Are you hungry? I can make some breakfast. Pancakes, maybe." At the mention of pancakes, Caleb's expression softened, though he tried to hide it. The guarded look in his eyes remained, but there was a flicker of something else, perhaps curiosity, or even a faint hint of excitement. Emma took it as a good sign and motioned for him to sit at the kitchen table. As she started preparing breakfast, John sat across from Caleb, hoping to get to know him better. "How are you feeling this morning?" he asked gently. Caleb shrugged, his gaze shifting to the floor. "Better, I guess." John nodded, giving him space to process. "We're really glad you're here, Caleb. I know things have been hard, but you don't have to go through it alone. There are people who want to help." Caleb's eyes flicked up, a skeptical glint in them. "People always say that," he muttered, almost to himself, "but they don't stick around." John's heart ached at the boy's mistrust. He knew it wasn't directed at him personally. It was the result of years of abandonment and broken promises. But it still hurt to see someone so young already so disillusioned. He wanted to tell Caleb that things would be different this time, that he and Emma were there to support him. But he knew that words wouldn't be enough. Emma placed a plate of pancakes in front of Caleb, along with a small bottle of syrup and a pat of butter. The sight of the warm, golden pancakes seemed to surprise him, as if he couldn't quite believe they were meant for him. "Go on, dig in," Emma encouraged with a smile. "You need your energy." Caleb took a cautious bite, his expression softening as the taste registered. For a moment, he allowed himself to enjoy it, but then he caught himself, the guarded look returning. He was used to scarcity, used to survival mode, and the comfort of a warm meal felt foreign. As he ate in silence, John watched him, his mind racing with possibilities. They could try to get Caleb in touch with social services, but that might mean sending him back into a system that had already failed him. John couldn't bear the thought of Caleb going back to that cycle of temporary homes and transient lives. He looked over at Emma, who gave him a small nod, encouraging him to try again. "Caleb," John began carefully, "I know you might not trust us yet. I can only imagine what you've been through. But we want to help. And I promise that we're here for you as long as you need." Caleb's gaze remained downcast, his fingers tracing the edges of the photograph he still held close. John took a deep breath, deciding to take a different approach. "You know, when I was younger, I lost someone close to me too," John said softly. "It felt like the world had lost its color, like I was floating through life without any real purpose. I didn't think I'd ever feel whole again. But over time, with the support of people who cared about me, I found my way back. And I'm really grateful for that." Caleb glanced up, a flicker of curiosity breaking through the wariness in his eyes. You lost someone too." John nodded. "Yeah, and it took a long time for me to heal. But the people who stayed by my side made all the difference." Caleb looked away again, his fingers tightening around the photograph. "My mom was all I had," he whispered. She always made me feel safe. But now—" Emma placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "It sounds like she was an incredible person," she said gently. "And you can carry her memory with you, just like you're doing now. But it's okay to let others in too. You don't have to carry everything on your own." Caleb's lower lip quivered, and he quickly looked away, as if embarrassed by his vulnerability. The room fell into a comfortable silence, broken only by the quiet clinking of silverware and the soft hum of morning light filling the space. Gradually, the tension in Caleb's shoulders eased, and he took another tentative bite of his breakfast. After a few minutes, Caleb set down his fork, looking over at John with a mixture of caution and curiosity. If I stayed here for a little while, Just until I figure things out. Would that be okay? John and Emma exchanged a look, their hearts swelling with relief and hope. John nodded, his voice warm. Of course, Caleb. You can stay here as long as you need. This is your home now for as long as you want it to be. A mix of emotions flickered across Caleb's face. Relief, gratitude, and a deep, unspoken sadness. He glanced down at his mother's photograph again, a look of resolve settling in his eyes. Thank you, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what to say. I didn't think anyone would. Emma moved closer, wrapping her arm around his shoulder in a gentle, motherly gesture. You don't have to say anything, sweetheart. We're just happy you're here. The day unfolded slowly, filled with small, quiet moments of connection. Caleb explored the house tentatively, often lingering by the window, gazing out at the peaceful suburban street with an expression that seemed both hopeful and afraid. He was still wary, still guarded, but a subtle shift had taken place. He was allowing himself to imagine a future, even if it was a fragile, uncertain one. Later in the afternoon, John invited Caleb to help him with a small repair in the garage. They worked together in companionable silence, and John was careful not to push, letting Caleb take the lead when he felt comfortable. The act of working side by side, of sharing a quiet task, seemed to soothe Caleb in a way words couldn't. That night, as they sat down to dinner, Caleb joined them at the table, and for the first time, he offered a tentative smile, a glimpse of the child he might have been before the world had cast him adrift. The conversation was light, and every now and then, Caleb would glance at John and Emma, his gaze softening with the slow realization that he wasn't alone. As the night wound down, Emma prepared a small guest room for Caleb, setting out fresh sheets and placing a soft, warm blanket at the foot of the bed. When she showed him the room, he looked around, his expression filled with a mix of awe and disbelief. Is this really for me?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Emma smiled, her heart breaking a little at the innocence in his question. "Yes, Caleb. It's all yours." He stood in the center of the room, looking as if he didn't quite believe it was real. Then, for the first time, he set down the photograph, placing it carefully on the nightstand. He glanced at Emma, who gave him a warm, reassuring nod. "Good night, Caleb," she said softly. "Sleep well." As she closed the door, she caught one last glimpse of him staring at the photograph on the nightstand, his expression filled with a mixture of grief and hope. And in that moment, she knew that the journey ahead would be long, but it would be filled with moments like these, small, precious victories that would gradually help him heal. And together, they would find a way to rebuild the pieces of his shattered world. Healing begins. The days that followed marked a quiet transformation in Caleb, one that John and Emma observed with a mixture of hope and tenderness. Each morning, Caleb emerged from his room with hesitant steps, as if afraid the warmth and comfort of the house might vanish like a dream upon waking. He often lingered by the kitchen doorway, waiting for permission to join them, his dark eyes watching with a guarded curiosity as John and Emma moved around, preparing breakfast or tidying up. It was as if he were trying to understand what home meant, what family felt like. Emma made a point of inviting him into small daily routines, encouraging him to join her in simple tasks, like folding laundry or helping her water the plants by the kitchen window. Sometimes he would only nod quietly, helping her in silence. Other times she would catch him glancing at her, his expression softened, a glimmer of trust slowly beginning to show. John, too, took a gentle approach, inviting Caleb to help him with small repairs around the house or offering to play a board game after dinner. He made sure not to push too hard, allowing Caleb the space he needed to feel safe. Every evening, John would pull out an old chess set his grandfather had given him, placing it on the coffee table as an open invitation. For the first few nights, Caleb simply watched, studying the board with a cautious curiosity. But one evening, he quietly asked John to teach him. That night, as they sat on the living room floor, John explained the rules patiently, moving each piece slowly, allowing Caleb to study their movements. For the first time since he had come into their home, Caleb showed a spark of interest, his gaze intent, his hand steady as he made each move. They played several rounds, Caleb's brow furrowing in concentration, his usual guarded expression momentarily replaced by focus and a sense of determination. As the game went on, John began to notice something remarkable. Caleb's eyes would occasionally flicker with the faintest glint of satisfaction when he made a particularly clever move. It was a small thing, but John could sense that it was the first time Caleb had felt a sense of accomplishment in a long time. When John finally admitted defeat in a playful tone, Caleb's lips twitched upward into a brief, fleeting smile. The moment was fragile, and John felt a surge of protectiveness as he saw Caleb's face brighten, even if only for a moment. He knew that rebuilding Caleb's trust in people, in himself, would take time. But for now, he was content with these small victories. The true test of Caleb's emerging trust came one rainy afternoon. Dark clouds had rolled in, casting shadows over the house, and the steady rhythm of rain against the windows filled the quiet spaces. John was at work, leaving Emma and Caleb alone for the day. She decided to bake, hoping the scent of freshly baked bread and cookies might bring some cheer to the gloomy day. She found Caleb by the window in the living room, his gaze distant as he watched the rain slide down the glass. His posture was tense, as though he were lost in memories too heavy for him to bear alone. "Caleb," Emma called gently, breaking his reverie. "Would you like to help me in the kitchen? I could use an extra pair of hands." He turned to her, looking hesitant, as if unsure whether the invitation was genuine. But she waited patiently, offering a small, encouraging smile. After a moment's pause, he nodded, standing up and following her to the kitchen. Emma set out the ingredients, guiding him through each step with a light-hearted tone, explaining how to knead the dough and measure the flour. Caleb listened intently, his eyes following her hands as she worked, mimicking her movements with quiet focus. As he kneaded the dough, his fingers pressing into the soft, pliable mass, Emma noticed a subtle change in his demeanor. There was a calmness to him, a sense of quiet absorption in the simple task, as if the act of creating something tangible with his hands allowed him to momentarily escape his troubled thoughts. "You're a natural," Emma said with a smile as he carefully shaped the dough into a ball, patting it gently. Caleb's lips curved upward, barely a hint of a smile, but it was enough to fill Emma with a sense of warmth. When the bread was in the oven, Emma began preparing cookies, showing Caleb how to mix the batter and form the dough into small balls. She caught him licking a stray bit of chocolate from his finger, his expression almost sheepish, and she couldn't help but laugh. As they worked, she began to tell him stories from her own childhood, small, silly memories of learning to bake with her grandmother, of flour fights and burnt cookies. Caleb listened quietly, his gaze softening as he absorbed each story. Emma sensed his curiosity growing, the flicker of a question forming in his mind, but she waited, allowing him to come to it on his own terms. Finally, as they placed the last tray in the oven, Caleb turned to her, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Did you ever feel like you didn't belong?" Emma paused, looking at him thoughtfully. "Yes," she admitted, her tone gentle. "There were times when I felt very alone. When my grandmother passed, I felt like I'd lost a part of myself. I struggled for a while, feeling lost, not sure where I fit anymore. But I found my way back, thanks to people who cared about me." Caleb looked down, his fingers tracing the edge of the counter. "My mom. She was the only one who ever made me feel like I belonged," he murmured. "Now, I don't know where I fit." Emma's heart ached at his words. She placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "It's okay to feel that way, Caleb. Losing someone who means that much to you, it can make you feel like the ground has been pulled out from under you. But I want you to know that you have a place here with us, as long as you need." Caleb didn't respond, but Emma noticed a subtle shift in his expression, a softening in his gaze. They shared a quiet moment, standing together in the warmth of the kitchen, the smell of freshly baked cookies filling the air. Emma sensed that her words had reached him, even if he wasn't ready to respond yet. Healing, she knew, was a slow process, and Caleb needed time to find his own way. The rain continued through the night, drumming steadily against the roof, but inside, the house was warm and filled with the comforting scent of baking. After dinner, John suggested they watch a movie together. Caleb sat between John and Emma on the couch, initially stiff and unsure, but as the movie went on, he began to relax. There was a scene in the movie that made him laugh, a rare, unguarded laugh that filled the room with an unexpected joy. John and Emma exchanged a glance, their hearts swelling as they watched him. It was a fleeting moment, but it felt like a breakthrough, a glimpse of the child Caleb had been before life had taken so much from him. As the movie ended, Caleb looked up at John, a question in his eyes. What happens if I don't go back to foster care? John took a deep breath, sensing the weight of the question. Well, Caleb, there are options. If you want, we can explore those together. But whatever you choose, you won't be alone. Caleb looked down, a mix of hope and uncertainty flickering in his gaze. Do you think I could stay here? Just for a while. Emma placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. Caleb, as long as you need to be here, you have a place. We're here for you. A silence fell over the room, filled with unspoken emotions. Caleb's hands tightened around his mother's photograph, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. For a moment, he looked as if he might retreat, as if the vulnerability was too much. But then he leaned ever so slightly toward Emma, his posture softening as he allowed himself to feel the comfort of her presence. The room filled with a profound sense of peace, as if the walls themselves were embracing the broken boy who had finally allowed himself to hope. John and Emma exchanged a look of shared resolve, silently committing to help Caleb find his way. Later, as Caleb lay in bed, he gazed at his mother's photograph on the nightstand, the flickering shadows of the rain dancing across it. For the first time, the weight in his chest felt a little lighter, the darkness a little less overwhelming. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he dared to believe that he might find a place to belong. And as he drifted into sleep, the house held him gently, as if wrapping him in the promise of safety and a love he had thought he'd lost forever. The ties that bind. Caleb awoke the next morning with a strange sense of warmth that felt foreign, like a memory of a distant dream he couldn't quite hold on to. For a moment, lying in the soft bed under the weight of the quilt, he allowed himself to imagine that he was home, that he was safe. The comfort was so unfamiliar, so unsettlingly gentle, that he almost wanted to push it away. But something stopped him. The sound of muffled laughter floated up from the kitchen, grounding him back into the present, reminding him that this wasn't just a dream. He hesitated before swinging his legs out of bed, pausing to touch the photograph on the nightstand. His mother's smile stared back at him, unwavering, her expression filled with love. He'd looked at that picture countless times over the past months, but today he felt something different, something that had been missing. A quiet assurance that maybe, just maybe, she'd approve of him being here. The thought brought a lump to his throat, and he quickly wiped his eyes before heading downstairs. In the kitchen, John and Emma were preparing breakfast, their laughter filling the space. The sight of them working side by side, moving in sync, made Caleb's heart ache with a strange mixture of envy and longing. They moved around each other with an ease born from years of companionship, a rhythm of life he had never truly experienced. John glanced up as Caleb entered, his face breaking into a warm smile. "Morning, buddy," John greeted him. "We're making waffles. You're just in time." Emma turned, her expression bright. "Good morning, Caleb. Did you sleep well?" Caleb nodded, mumbling a soft, "Yes, thank you," as he settled at the table. The smell of waffles and syrup was comforting, reminding him of mornings with his mother, when she'd occasionally surprise him with pancakes on special days. He felt a pang of guilt for enjoying the warmth and kindness that John and Emma offered, as if it were somehow a betrayal of the love he'd shared with his mom. Emma placed a plate in front of him, piled with fluffy waffles and a generous dollop of whipped cream. "Eat up, sweetheart. You've got to keep up your strength if you're going to help John with the garden today." Caleb looked at her in surprise, his eyes widening. "The garden?" John nodded, smiling. "Yep. We're putting in new plants for the season, and I could use an extra set of hands. It's hard work, but you strike me as someone who's not afraid of a little dirt." Caleb looked down at his plate, his heart swelling with an unexpected sense of belonging. They were including him in their lives, not as a visitor or a guest, but as if he were already part of their family. He glanced up, a shy smile breaking through his usual reserve. I'd like that," he murmured, feeling the warmth he hadn't known in months. Later that morning, Caleb found himself standing in the backyard beside John, surveying the flower beds and vegetable patches that lined the fence. The garden was a modest space, but it was filled with life, vibrant flowers, budding plants, and small sprouts that promised future harvests. He hadn't realized how much he missed being outside, the smell of earth and fresh grass filling his lungs. "Here," John handed him a pair of gloves and a small trowel. "We're going to start by clearing out the weeds and loosening the soil. Then we'll add some compost and put in the new plants. It's a bit of work, but it'll be worth it when everything starts growing." Caleb nodded, pulling on the gloves and crouching down to dig into the earth. The sensation of the soil beneath his fingers was grounding, anchoring him in a way he hadn't expected. He worked in silence beside John, both of them absorbed in the steady rhythm of digging, pulling, and planting. As they worked, John began sharing small snippets about his own childhood, stories of helping his grandfather with the garden, tales of summers spent outdoors, tending to plants that would one day bear fruit. Caleb listened quietly, taking in each story, feeling an odd sense of comfort in the gentle cadence of John's voice. He couldn't remember the last time someone had simply talked to him, sharing memories without expecting anything in return. "You know," John said after a while, wiping his brow and glancing over at Caleb, "gardening teaches you a lot about patience. It's one of those things where you don't see the results right away. You have to tend to it every day, even if it doesn't look like much is happening. But when you stay with it, something beautiful starts to grow." Caleb looked down at the small patch of soil he was tending, his hands frozen for a moment. John's words resonated deeply, speaking to something he hadn't dared to hope for. I guess it's like life then," he said softly, more to himself than to John. "You have to wait and keep hoping." John nodded, his gaze thoughtful. "Exactly. Sometimes it feels like nothing's changing, but then one day you look back and realize how much you've grown." They continued working in companionable silence, and for the first time, Caleb allowed himself to imagine a future where he might belong, where he might grow roots and flourish like the plants they were tending. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. As the days passed, Caleb found himself settling into the routines of the house, his initial hesitation slowly giving way to a quiet acceptance. Emma and John's kindness continued to surprise him. They never pushed, never pried, allowing him to navigate his emotions in his own time. They didn't treat him like a guest, nor did they impose any expectations. Instead, they offered small moments of connection, a warm meal, a shared laugh, a gentle word of encouragement that slowly built a foundation of trust. One evening after dinner, Emma invited Caleb to join her in the living room, where she'd set up a small art station. She'd noticed how Caleb's eyes lit up whenever they passed by a gallery or art supply store, though he'd never mentioned it himself. "I thought maybe we could do some painting together," Emma said, her tone casual. "Nothing fancy, just for fun. What do you think?" Caleb looked at her, his expression uncertain. He hadn't painted since his mother passed, hadn't allowed himself the joy of creativity. But there was something about the softness in Emma's gaze, the openness of her invitation, that made him want to try. They spent the evening painting side by side, Emma humming softly to herself as she worked, her brushstrokes light and playful. Caleb watched her, mimicking her technique, his own strokes tentative at first, then gradually bolder as he lost himself in the colors and shapes. For the first time in months, he felt a spark of joy, a sense of expression that had been locked away for too long. When they finished, Emma looked at his painting, a soft smile gracing her face. "That's beautiful, Caleb. You have a real talent." Caleb ducked his head, his cheeks flushing. It's nothing special," he mumbled, though he couldn't hide the flicker of pride in his eyes. "It is special," Emma insisted gently. "Everything you create is special, because it's a part of you." Her words lingered in his mind, planting seeds of self-worth that he hadn't felt in a long time. She made him feel seen, valued in a way that was both humbling and uplifting. One evening, as Caleb was heading to bed, he paused by John's study, where he could hear the faint sound of voices. The door was slightly ajar, and he caught snippets of John's conversation with Emma. "I just want him to know he's safe," John was saying softly. "I want him to feel like he has a place here, that he doesn't have to be afraid." Emma's voice was equally gentle. "He's been through so much. But I think he's starting to believe it. We just have to be patient." Caleb's chest tightened as he listened, a swell of emotion rising within him. He'd never overheard someone talking about him with such care, as if his presence truly mattered. He slipped away before they could notice him, his heart pounding as he climbed into bed, the weight of their words wrapping around him like a protective blanket. Lying in the quiet darkness, he felt a profound shift within himself. For the first time, he dared to believe that he was wanted, that he was safe. The house felt like a shelter, a haven he could return to without fear of abandonment. And for the first time, he allowed himself to truly feel the warmth of that security, letting it seep into the deepest parts of himself that had been starved of love for so long. The next day, he shyly approached John, a question lingering in his eyes. "John," he began hesitantly, "do you think I could stay here? I mean, for longer, not just a few days." John's face softened, and he placed a reassuring hand on Caleb's shoulder. "Caleb, as long as you want to stay, this is your home. Emma and I are here for you, no matter what." Caleb felt a wave of relief wash over him, a release of tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. For the first time, he felt truly at peace, the darkness that had once consumed him beginning to fade in the presence of this newfound light. As he looked up at John, a tear slipped down his cheek, but this time it was a tear of gratitude, of acceptance, of hope. He finally allowed himself to believe that he belonged, that he was home. And in that moment, he knew he'd found something he thought he'd lost forever: a family, a place where he could grow, heal, and perhaps even thrive. A new beginning. The days that followed Caleb's quiet request to stay felt like a gift wrapped in small, simple moments of joy and healing. With each sunrise, he began to let go of his tightly held fears, embracing a life where stability and kindness were constants rather than fleeting moments. John and Emma's home, once an unfamiliar place, was gradually becoming a part of him, filling the empty spaces left by loss and loneliness. One morning, Caleb awoke to find that the house was alive with a particular kind of bustling energy. Emma was in the kitchen, humming softly as she baked, her apron dusted with flour. The smell of fresh bread wafted through the house, filling it with warmth. John was busy outside, setting up tables and chairs in the backyard, a subtle look of excitement in his eyes. Caleb's curiosity grew as he watched them move around with purpose. He ventured into the kitchen, glancing up at Emma with a questioning look. "Is something special happening today?" Emma turned, her eyes bright as she looked at him. "Yes, actually. Today's a bit of a celebration." "Celebration?" Caleb echoed, confused. He couldn't recall any mention of a holiday or birthday. Emma placed a gentle hand on his shoulder, guiding him to a chair at the kitchen table. She sat across from him, her expression soft and kind. "John and I talked, and we thought it would be nice to have a small gathering. A chance for you to meet some of our friends, to feel more connected." Caleb's initial reaction was a wave of anxiety. The thought of meeting new people, of allowing others into the world he was just beginning to trust, was daunting. But Emma must have sensed his hesitation, because she quickly added, "These are people who care about you, Caleb. They're here to welcome you, to make sure you know you're part of something bigger." He swallowed, nodding slowly, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. A part of him still felt like an outsider, like a ghost slipping through life unnoticed. But another part of him, the part that had started to bloom in this home, yearned for connection, for roots that extended beyond his memories. By the early afternoon, the backyard was filled with people, friends and neighbors of John and Emma, who had come with open hearts and welcoming smiles. Caleb hovered near the edges of the gathering, watching with cautious interest. Each face, each gentle smile, felt like an invitation, and he gradually allowed himself to inch closer, drawn to the warmth of the gathering. A few people approached him, introducing themselves with kindness that felt genuine. They asked simple questions about his interests, sharing small stories from their own lives. One of John's friends, an elderly man named Bill, struck up a conversation about gardening, his eyes twinkling as he described the art of growing tomatoes. "You know, it's all about finding the right balance," Bill said, his voice calm and steady. "Tomatoes need sunlight, but not too much, water, but not too much. It's like raising a child. Really, you have to be patient, give them what they need, and trust that they'll grow strong on their own." Caleb listened, nodding as Bill shared his wisdom. He found himself thinking about the garden he'd helped John with, about how much pride he felt watching the small plants they'd nurtured together begin to grow. It struck him that he, too, was like one of those plants, taking root, finding strength in the care of others. As the afternoon wore on, John approached Caleb, his face filled with warmth and a touch of pride. "How are you holding up?" Caleb looked up at him, the hint of a smile on his lips. "Good, I think." He paused, glancing around at the gathering. "It's nice. I didn't think people would, care." John's expression softened, and he placed a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "You're part of this community now, Caleb. People care about you, and they're here to make sure you know that." For the first time, Caleb felt the full weight of those words. They weren't just empty promises. They were real, tangible expressions of love and belonging. He looked up at John, his voice barely a whisper. "Thank you for everything." John knelt down so he was at eye level, his gaze steady and reassuring. "You don't have to thank us, Caleb. We're just glad you're here." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the bond between them deepening with each shared look. For the first time in a long time, Caleb felt truly, undeniably seen. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the gathering, Emma called everyone to the table. She prepared a beautiful spread of food, each dish thoughtfully made, filling the air with delicious scents. Plates were passed, laughter and conversation flowed freely, and Caleb found himself joining in, his nervousness slowly giving way to enjoyment. After they'd eaten, John rose from his seat, holding a small box in his hands. He cleared his throat, catching everyone's attention. "I just wanted to take a moment to say a few words," he began, glancing at Emma, who gave him an encouraging smile. "When Emma and I decided to open our home to Caleb, we didn't realize just how much he would come to mean to us. In a short time, he's become a part of our lives in ways we couldn't have imagined. He's brought laughter, kindness, and a sense of resilience that has inspired us both." Caleb felt his cheeks grow warm, a mix of embarrassment and gratitude washing over him. He hadn't expected John to speak about him in front of everyone, to express a love he still struggled to believe he deserved. John continued, his voice filled with emotion. "Emma and I want Caleb to know that he has a place here, not just in this house, but in our hearts, and we want to make sure he feels that every day." He extended the box toward Caleb, his eyes shining. Caleb's hands trembled slightly as he took it, his mind racing with a mixture of curiosity and disbelief. With everyone watching, he carefully opened the box, revealing a small silver key resting on a soft cushion of fabric. "It's a key to our home," John explained softly. "We wanted you to know that this is your home now, for as long as you want it to be. Your family, Caleb." The room fell silent as Caleb stared at the key, his vision blurring with tears he couldn't hold back. He looked up at John and Emma, his heart swelling with an overwhelming gratitude he couldn't put into words. I don't know what to say," he choked out, his voice barely audible. Emma stepped forward, wrapping her arms around him in a gentle hug. "You don't have to say anything, sweetheart. Just know that you're loved." For the first time in his life, Caleb allowed himself to believe it fully, to accept the love that had been offered to him without condition. He felt his walls crumbling, the pain and fear he'd carried for so long dissolving in the warmth of their embrace. As the evening turned to night, the gathering continued, filled with laughter, stories, and a sense of togetherness that Caleb had never experienced before. For once, he felt that he wasn't standing on the outside looking in. He was a part of this circle, woven into the fabric of a community that had opened its arms to him. Later, as the guests began to leave, Caleb lingered in the backyard, gazing up at the stars. John joined him, standing beside him in comfortable silence. "It's funny," Caleb said after a while, his voice soft. "I used to look at the stars and feel so alone, like I was just one small, unimportant part of the universe." John looked up at the sky, his expression thoughtful. "You're not alone anymore, Caleb. And you're not unimportant. You're part of something bigger now." Caleb nodded, a sense of peace settling over him. For the first time, he felt grounded, connected to the world around him, to the people who had embraced him. He felt like he was home. They stood together under the vast, star-filled sky, two figures bound by love and trust, and in that quiet moment, Caleb knew that he had found a family, not just in John and Emma, but in everyone who had gathered to welcome him. They had given him a second chance, a new beginning, and he was ready to accept it with an open heart. The pain of his past hadn't disappeared, but it no longer defined him. Instead, it was a part of his story, a chapter that had led him to this moment, to this place where he was surrounded by love. And as he stood there, the silver key clutched in his hand, he realized that he was no longer an outsider. He was a son, a friend, a part of a family that had chosen him as much as he had chosen them. With a deep breath, he looked over at John, a sense of joy filling him. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with gratitude. John placed a hand on his shoulder, his eyes shining. "You're welcome, Caleb. Welcome home." The road ahead. In the weeks that followed the gathering, Caleb's life shifted in ways he could never have anticipated. The symbolic weight of the small silver key John had given him stayed with him every day, tucked securely in his pocket, a reminder that he was no longer drifting through life alone. For the first time, he was beginning to understand what it meant to be part of a family, to have people who cared about him and a place to return to where he was wanted and needed. But healing wasn't a straight line. There were moments when the darkness would still creep in, when doubts would claw at him, whispering that this new life was too good to be true, that it could vanish as easily as it had appeared. Those were the days he'd find himself sitting quietly in the corner of his room, clutching his mother's photograph, feeling the old ache of loss and the fresh fear of attachment in equal measure. John and Emma were patient, always giving him the space he needed to process, never pushing him to reveal more than he was ready to share. They understood that healing required time, and that each step forward might come with a few steps back. Still, they were unwavering in their support, gently guiding him through each day with a steady hand. One evening, Caleb came home from school with a solemn look on his face, He'd started attending the local middle school a few weeks prior, and while the adjustment had been challenging, he'd begun to find a rhythm there, even making a few tentative friendships. But today, he looked troubled, his shoulders hunched as he entered the house. John noticed immediately, his expression softening as he approached. "Hey, Caleb. Everything all right?" Caleb hesitated, glancing down at the floor. Something happened at school today." John nodded, guiding him to the living room couch. "Do you want to talk about it?" Caleb took a deep breath, his fingers twisting nervously. There was this kid, a new kid. He looked kind of lost, like he didn't have anyone. Some of the other kids started teasing him, calling him names. I didn't know what to do." John listened attentively, his gaze focused on Caleb with understanding and patience. "That must have been hard to see. Did you feel like you wanted to help him?" Caleb nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah, I know what it's like, feeling alone like that. But I was afraid. I didn't want the other kids to turn on me too." John placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's okay, Caleb. It's natural to feel that way. Standing up for someone can be hard, especially when it means putting yourself at risk. But the fact that you cared, that you wanted to help, that says a lot about who you are." Caleb looked up, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "Do you think, maybe next time I could do something, that I could be strong enough?" John smiled, pride evident in his expression. "I know you can, Caleb. You're already stronger than you realize. And remember, being strong doesn't mean you have to face things alone. You can always talk to me, or a teacher, or someone else you trust." The reassurance brought a sense of calm to Caleb, and he allowed himself to lean into John's words, to believe that he was capable of growth, of becoming the person he wanted to be. In the following weeks, Caleb continued to navigate the challenges of school with a newfound sense of confidence. Slowly, he began to reach out to others, finding friends who, like him, had their own stories of loss or struggle. He gravitated toward those who felt like outsiders, connecting with them in ways that felt genuine and deep. He'd even approached the boy he'd mentioned to John, offering a quiet word of kindness when the others weren't looking. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a start, a way for him to share a piece of his own journey with someone else. At home, Caleb's bond with John and Emma grew stronger. He helped John with more projects around the house, taking pride in small tasks that allowed him to feel useful and capable. He'd even taken over the care of the garden, carefully tending to each plant with the same patience and attention John had taught him. Each sprout, each budding flower, felt like a small victory, a sign that he, too, could thrive with the right care and nurturing. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Emma mentioned something that took Caleb by surprise. "John and I were thinking of taking a weekend trip up to the cabin," she said, her eyes sparkling. "It's by a lake, surrounded by woods. A great place to relax and unwind. We thought you might like to come with us." Caleb's eyes widened, excitement flickering across his face. He'd never been to a cabin, never even been to a lake. The thought of spending time away from the city, of being surrounded by nature, filled him with anticipation. I'd love that," he replied, his voice barely concealing his eagerness. Emma smiled, reaching over to squeeze his hand. "Then it's settled. We'll leave Friday after school." The trip to the cabin felt like a journey into another world. As they drove through winding roads lined with towering trees, Caleb watched the scenery with wide-eyed wonder, his heart racing with excitement. When they finally arrived, he was greeted by the sight of a cozy cabin nestled among the trees, with the shimmering lake just a short walk away. The air was crisp, carrying the earthy scent of pine and moss, and the quietness of the place was both peaceful and invigorating. That first evening, after they'd unpacked and settled in, John suggested they go for a walk along the lake. The sun was beginning to set, casting a warm, golden glow over the water, and Caleb felt a sense of calm settle over him as they walked in comfortable silence. Every now and then, John would point out a particular tree or a bird, sharing bits of knowledge that made Caleb appreciate the beauty of the wilderness even more. As they reached a small clearing by the lake, John stopped, looking out over the water with a thoughtful expression. "You know, when I was your age, my dad used to bring me here," he said softly. "This place holds a lot of memories for me. It's where I learned about patience, about the value of silence, and it's where I realize that sometimes it's okay to just be." Caleb looked up at John, his heart swelling with gratitude. He felt a kinship with John, an understanding that went beyond words. They both carried memories of loss and love, of lessons passed down through generations. And now John was passing those lessons on to him. They sat together on a fallen log, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the sky painted in hues of pink and orange. Caleb felt the urge to share something, a piece of himself that he'd kept hidden, even from John and Emma. "John," he began, his voice barely more than a whisper, "sometimes I still feel like I don't deserve this. Like maybe it's all just a dream, and one day I'll wake up, and it'll all be gone." John turned to him, his gaze steady and filled with understanding. "I can't promise that life will always be easy, Caleb, but I can promise you this: you're not alone. You have a place here, with us, no matter what, and you deserve every bit of happiness that comes your way." Caleb's eyes filled with tears, and he looked away, embarrassed by his vulnerability. But John placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, letting him know it was okay to feel, to express the emotions he'd kept locked away for so long. In that moment, Caleb felt a deep release, a shedding of the pain and fear that had haunted him since his mother's death. He realized that he no longer had to carry the weight of his past alone, that he had people who would help him bear it, who would walk beside him on this journey. They sat together in the growing darkness, the stars beginning to appear above them, each one a small point of light in the vastness of the sky. And as they looked up, Caleb felt a sense of peace settle over him, a certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The weekend passed in a blur of laughter and quiet moments, of shared stories and peaceful solitude. They spent their days exploring the woods, fishing by the lake, and sitting by the fireplace in the evenings, listening to the crackling of the flames as they shared their thoughts and dreams. For Caleb, the trip was a revelation, a chance to see himself not as a lost, broken child, but as someone capable of growth, of connection, of love. He realized that he didn't have to be defined by his past, that he could build a new life filled with hope and purpose. On the last night, as they sat around a small campfire, Emma took out a small notebook and handed it to Caleb. "I thought you might like this," she said, her eyes warm. "It's a journal, a place for you to write down your thoughts, your memories, anything you want." Caleb took the notebook, his fingers tracing the cover. He felt a rush of gratitude, a sense of belonging that went deeper than words. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Emma smiled, reaching over to hug him. "You're welcome, Caleb. You deserve a life filled with memories and dreams, with moments that are yours to hold on to." That night, as he lay in bed, Caleb opened the journal, staring at the blank pages. Slowly, he picked up a pen and began to write, his words flowing freely as he poured his heart onto the paper. He wrote about his mother, about the loss he'd carried, about the kindness he'd found in John and Emma. And as he wrote, he felt a sense of healing, of release, as if he were finally letting go of the pain that had defined him for so long. The weekend at the cabin marked a turning point, a shift in Caleb's life that would stay with him forever. When they returned home, he carried a newfound confidence, a sense of purpose that guided him through each day. He continued to grow, to open his heart to the world around him, knowing that he was no longer alone. He had a family, a place to call home. And with each passing day, he became more certain that he was exactly where he was meant to be, his life unfolding in ways he had never dared to dream. He was a part of something beautiful, something lasting, a family that would stand by him through every challenge, every joy, every step of the journey. And as he stepped into the future, Caleb knew that he carried with him a love that would light his path, guiding him forward with the quiet strength and resilience he had found in the home he now called his own.